Hello. Today's story will bring you something so shocking that it will take your breath away. A moment that will make you think about how fragile and unpredictable our lives are. But before you get comfortable, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's really interesting to see who has joined us. Now get comfortable, because we're starting. Marta sat on the cold kitchen floor, staring into the empty pot in front of her. The last scraps of food had been scraped out hours ago. Her stomach growled, but she barely noticed it anymore. Hunger had become a constant companion, one she could no longer ignore, though she had tried. In the dim light of the kitchen, everything seemed to echo with silence and emptiness. Her fingers brushed across the rough wooden floor, feeling the cool surface, as if trying to ground herself in a reality she didn't want to face. Her 3 children, Liza, Michael, and Jacob, were exhausted from another long day of scrounging for work, for anything to survive. They hadn't had a proper meal in days, but none of them complained. They'd learned, perhaps too young, that complaining did nothing to fill an empty stomach. Marta had made sure of that. When they came home, looking more worn than when they had left in the morning, she could feel the weight of their exhaustion pressing down on the small space. The walls of their modest apartment, the only home they had, seemed to close in on them as the day drew to a close. Each corner was filled with the shadows of their lives marked by struggle, by survival. "Mom," Liza's voice broke the silence. The eldest, just 22, already carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She stood at the doorway, her eyes wide with the same silent plea that Marta had seen in them countless times before. She wasn't asking for food. No, she knew that was impossible. But the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. What now? Marta's lips twitched into a weak smile, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She reached for the last remaining packet of macaroni, the only thing left in the pantry. The empty shelves mocked her, a cruel reminder of their dwindling resources. "There's enough for everyone," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll make do." Liza nodded, her gaze softening. But Marta could see the pain there. Pain that Liza hid so well, but that Marta had long since learned to recognize. Liza had grown up too fast. She had seen too much. Marta had tried to protect her, tried to keep the reality of their situation hidden from her. But there was only so much she could do. The world outside had no mercy, and neither did hunger. They sat together around the table as Marta prepared the meal. It was a meager portion, but it would have to be enough. It always had to be enough. "I'll get some water," Michael said suddenly, his voice low. He was a few years younger than Liza, but just as burdened by the weight of their lives. He turned and walked toward the sink, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. Marta watched as he filled a small glass with water, then took it back to the table. He didn't drink it, just set it down in front of him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of forks scraping against plates, the soft clink of metal on ceramic, and the occasional cough from one of the children. They ate in silence. Marta didn't want to look at them. If she did, she might see the hunger in their eyes, the same hunger that she felt gnawing at her insides. She couldn't let them know the truth. They needed her strong. They needed her to believe that everything would be okay. And so, she swallowed her own fears and pretended to eat, her heart breaking with every bite. The night dragged on, each second a reminder of the inevitable. She knew that tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The endless search for food, for work, for anything that could keep them going. And it would always be the same. They would run out. They would always run out. And she would be the one to watch them suffer. But tonight, she couldn't think about that. Tonight, she had to be a mother. She had to pretend. As they finished their meager meal, Marta cleared the table, trying not to look at the empty plates, trying not to feel the emptiness that surrounded them. The only sound in the room now was the soft rustle of the wind outside, the whispers of a world that didn't care. She forced a smile when Liza caught her eye, but it was weak, fleeting. Liza smiled back, but there was no joy in it. She was tired. They were all tired. "Sleep, Mom," Liza said quietly, her voice tender but firm. "We'll figure something out tomorrow." Marta nodded. She stood up, her legs weak beneath her, and made her way to the bedroom. The bed was small, too small for the 4 of them, but they made do. Tonight, Liza would sleep on the floor, as she always did. They couldn't afford to be picky about such things. But even as Marta lay down, her body aching from the effort of pretending, she couldn't help but feel the gnawing, insistent hunger that had become her constant companion. And as she closed her eyes, she thought of what tomorrow might bring. Would they find food? Would they find work? Or would it be another day of emptiness? And she knew, deep down, that no matter what happened, she would have to find a way to keep going. For them. For her children. Even if it meant giving up everything. The next morning came too soon, as always. Marta woke with the familiar weight of hunger pressing on her chest, the dull ache of an empty stomach gnawing at her. She didn't want to get out of bed, but she had no choice. Her children needed her to move, to get up, to act like everything was still under control. But the truth was, nothing was under control anymore. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of her children waking. Liza was the first to get up. Marta could hear the soft shuffle of her feet on the floor as she made her way to the kitchen. She imagined Liza, still half asleep, rubbing her eyes, but already fully aware of the situation. She'd grown up too fast, as if time had stolen her childhood. Marta tried to ignore the reality of the situation, tried to tell herself that somehow, today would be different. Maybe they would get lucky. Maybe someone would offer them food, or a job or something. But deep down, she knew luck hadn't been on their side for a long time. Liza came into the room quietly, her face pale from a restless night. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes searching Marta's face for any hint of hope. But Marta had nothing to give her. She couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. "Mom, we have to talk," Liza said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a tremor in her tone, and Marta's heart sank. Marta pushed herself up into a sitting position. She met Liza's gaze, trying to hide the fear that lingered behind her eyes. She knew what Liza was going to say, but she wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. Liza bit her lip, struggling with the words, but finally spoke. "We can't keep going like this. We're out of everything. There's nothing left. I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we ask for help. We can't keep pretending everything's fine." Marta closed her eyes, her hands clutching the blanket beneath her. She could feel the tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't cry. Not now. Not when Liza was looking at her with those hopeful eyes. "Liza, we can't. We can't go to anyone for help," Marta said, her voice firm despite the doubt gnawing at her. "You know that. You know what happens when people find out how bad things are. They'll take us away. They'll separate us. I won't let that happen." Liza's face faltered for a moment, but she didn't argue. She knew her mother's pride. She knew Marta wouldn't ask for help, no matter how dire the situation became. Marta had never been one to rely on others. She had always fought for her children, always believed that as long as she was alive, they would survive. But what if that wasn't enough anymore? Marta could see the doubt in Liza's eyes. She could see the way her daughter was slowly coming to terms with the idea that maybe survival wasn't just about grit and determination. Maybe it was about something more, something she hadn't been able to give them. "I'm sorry," Liza whispered, getting up from the bed. She wiped her eyes quickly, as though to erase any weakness. She was so much like Marta, strong and determined, but still so young. Marta's heart twisted at the sight of her. She wanted to tell Liza that everything would be okay, that they would find a way out of this mess. But she knew better. There was no easy way out. No miracle was coming. That evening, Marta made the last of the food. There was a bit of rice left, but that was it. She could see the hunger in their eyes as they sat down to eat. But they didn't complain. They hadn't complained for weeks now. They knew there was nothing left to say. The meal was sparse, even by their standards, but it was all they had. She watched them eat, her heart aching. The sound of silverware scraping against plates was the only noise in the room. "You're eating too fast," Marta said quietly to Jacob, her youngest. "Slow down." Jacob looked up at her, his wide eyes full of confusion. He wasn't used to being told to eat slowly, but Marta had no other words. The urgency in her voice wasn't just about food. It was about the fact that she knew this might be their last meal together. After dinner, she went to the small window in the kitchen and looked out at the street. There was a dullness to the city now, a kind of quiet desperation that seemed to hang in the air. People went about their daily routines, but there was no joy in their movements. It was as though everyone was waiting for something, waiting for an end or a beginning. Marta had spent so many years running from the end, from the inevitable conclusion of their struggles. But now, she could feel it creeping closer. She had no illusions anymore. There was no more fighting. That night, she lay awake, staring into the darkness. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she might have done wrong. Was there something she could have done differently? Should she have gone to that food bank weeks ago, when they still had a little bit of hope left? But the thought of asking for help was too much to bear. She couldn't imagine the shame of it, the feeling of having to admit that she had failed. She thought about what Liza had said earlier, about asking for help, but she couldn't shake the fear that help would come too late, or worse, that it would tear them apart. She would never allow that. She couldn't. But then, something shifted within her. She could feel the last spark of something that could keep them going, just a little longer. A decision was made. When morning came, Marta was already awake. She didn't want to wake her children, but there was no time to waste. She had to act now. They couldn't survive on hope alone anymore. She made the hardest decision she'd ever had to make. She would give them everything she had left. The morning came too early, as it always did, with an insistent ache in Marta's body. She had barely slept, the quiet torment of hunger keeping her awake. Every muscle in her body ached, but it was a different kind of pain now. It wasn't just from the constant work and worry. It was from the sickness that had slowly crept into her bones, a gnawing weakness that wasn't going away. She felt it when she tried to rise from the bed. Her legs shook, her vision blurred, her stomach twisted in a sickening knot. But she pushed through it. She had no choice. Her children depended on her, even if they didn't understand how bad things had become. Liza was already awake when Marta made it to the kitchen. She had that same tired look on her face, the one she wore every day now. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the look of someone who had already lost so much, and knew they were about to lose even more. Liza didn't say anything as Marta shuffled into the room, but there was a silence between them, a shared understanding that couldn't be put into words. "Mom, do you feel okay?" Liza asked cautiously, her voice full of concern. She watched her mother carefully, as though searching for signs of the illness that had been so slow to manifest. Marta smiled faintly, but it wasn't a real smile. It was just the kind of smile she gave when she wanted to reassure her children, when she needed to give them hope. But Liza saw through it. She always did. "I'm fine," Marta said softly, trying to sound convincing. "Just tired." "We're all tired." Liza didn't buy it, but she didn't push further. She had learned long ago that when her mother said something like that, it meant the opposite. She knew Marta was hiding the truth, knew it in her bones. But she couldn't force her to talk about it. Not yet. The rest of the morning passed in silence, as it had every day for the past few weeks. Marta gave them the last bit of rice and water for breakfast, just like the night before. It wasn't enough to fill them, but it was all they had. Michael didn't speak at all, his eyes hollow and distant. Jacob, the youngest, seemed to be the only one still unaware of how bad things were. But Marta knew that wouldn't last much longer. She couldn't pretend anymore. As the day wore on, the emptiness in the house seemed to grow. It was like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them, trapping them in a nightmare that none of them could escape. Marta could feel it in her bones, the weight of their reality, the crushing despair of knowing that no matter what she did, it wouldn't be enough. She could no longer protect them from the inevitable. No matter how hard she tried, they were running out of time. That evening, after another long day of searching for work, Liza and Michael came back to the apartment, their faces haggard with exhaustion. They barely spoke to each other, but Marta could see it in their eyes. They knew what was happening. They could feel the loss. The hunger had reached a point where it couldn't be ignored anymore. Liza walked over to Marta, her face pale, her eyes tired but determined. "Mom," she said quietly, "we need to talk. This can't go on. You're getting worse. We're all getting worse." Marta didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, too tired to argue, too weary to pretend anymore. She had known this moment was coming, but she wasn't ready for it. Not yet. Liza sat down beside her, her gaze fixed on the floor. "You have to let us help, Mom. You can't keep doing everything on your own. I don't care if you don't want to ask for help. We can't keep living like this." Marta's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to say something, to push back, to tell Liza that they couldn't ask for help. She couldn't bear the thought of being seen as weak, of being forced to admit how far they had fallen. But she didn't say anything. She couldn't. Not when she knew Liza was right. She looked at her children, one by one. They were all staring at her now, their faces a mix of fear and desperation. They knew it too. They knew they were running out of time, and they knew that their mother was slipping away from them, just as they were slipping away from the world. Marta swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She couldn't stop the tears from welling up, even though she wanted to. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept it all together. But now, she was falling apart. She could feel it in her bones. The illness, the hunger, the fatigue. It was all catching up to her. She was fading. Slowly. Quietly. But surely. "I'll be fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just need to rest. I need to rest for a while." But Liza wasn't convinced. "Mom," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You can't keep pretending everything is fine. We need to do something. We need to do it now." Marta didn't have an answer. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't ask for help. She couldn't face the idea of being looked down on, of being seen as someone who had failed. But the truth was, she had already failed, and they were all paying the price for it. That night, as the shadows crept in, Marta lay in bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. She could hear her children moving around the apartment, the sounds of them trying to make do with what little they had. But there was no escape from the truth. They were all running on empty, and she knew deep down that if she didn't find a way to get food or help, it would be the end of them. But there was nothing left. Nothing. The only thing she had to give now was the last of her strength. The days blurred together now, each one indistinguishable from the next. Hunger, fatigue, and despair had become their constant companions. Marta felt as though she were moving through a thick fog, each step slower and heavier than the last. The weakness in her body was no longer something she could ignore. Her legs trembled with each movement, and every time she rose from the bed, it felt like the world was spinning around her, ready to pull her down. But she couldn't afford to lie down and give in. Not yet. Liza had begun doing everything she could to take care of the family, running errands, searching for food, trying to scrape together what little work she could find. But even she was breaking under the strain. Michael, too, had taken on a greater burden, helping with whatever he could. But neither of them could fill the void left by Marta's weakening presence. Marta knew they were worried about her. They were trying to hide it, but she could see it in their eyes. Liza's quiet glances, Michael's silence when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Everything spoke of the growing fear they couldn't yet voice. Her children could feel it. They knew she was slipping away. They knew that time was running out. The truth was inescapable now. She could feel her body giving up, piece by piece. The lack of food had finally taken its toll. Her limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. She had no energy left to keep up the charade. But it wasn't just the hunger. The sickness had started too. A constant nagging fever that made her skin feel like it was on fire one moment, and then freezing the next. Her vision was becoming blurred, and dizziness came in waves. She couldn't keep pretending. She couldn't keep lying to her children, pretending that everything would be okay. It was late one afternoon when Marta collapsed. She had been trying to get up to make the children some dinner, if you could even call it that. The few scraps she'd gathered together the night before had been finished off long ago. She had nothing left, but she still couldn't stop herself from trying. She had to do something. She had to make sure they survived. She couldn't bear the thought of them going without her. As she reached for the edge of the counter to steady herself, her legs gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor in a heap. The room spun around her, and for a moment, everything went dark. Liza rushed into the kitchen when she heard the sound of Marta falling. She knelt down beside her mother, her hands shaking as she tried to lift her up. "Mom, what happened?" Liza's voice was filled with panic, but Marta couldn't answer. Her throat was dry, her body so weak that she could barely keep her eyes open. "Mom!" Liza's voice cracked, louder now, filled with fear. "Please speak to me. What's happening?" Marta could only manage a weak, hoarse breath. She felt the tears welling up in Liza's eyes, and she wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, that she'd be fine. But she couldn't lie. Not anymore. She had nothing left to give. Liza's hands trembled as she held her mother. She knew. She knew the truth now. "Mom, you need to let us help you," Liza said, her voice breaking. "You can't keep doing this alone. Please, you need to let us help." But Marta couldn't speak. She could only nod faintly, barely able to lift her head. The dizziness was too much, and the cold sweat that covered her skin told her that her body was shutting down. It was a slow, painful process, but there was nothing more to do. She had given everything she had to give. Liza looked up at Michael, who had just entered the room. His face was pale, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. "Get water," Liza said urgently, "and call someone. We need help." Michael hesitated for a moment, staring at Marta as though he couldn't believe what was happening. Then, without a word, He ran to get water and the phone. Liza stayed beside her mother, holding her hand, trying to comfort her as best she could. But the truth was, there was no comforting this. There was no easy way to make this better. Marta was fading, and no amount of hope, no amount of pleading could change that. As Marta lay there, unable to move or speak, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The guilt, the sadness, the fear. It was all too much. But there was also something else. A quiet acceptance. She had done everything she could for her children. She had given them every ounce of her strength, every last breath of her life. And now, in this moment, she realized that she was letting go. She wasn't going to make it. Liza continued to hold her hand, her grip tight and desperate. She refused to let go, even as the tears streamed down her face. She couldn't let go of her mother. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her, but she could feel it in her bones. This was the end. Michael returned with a glass of water and a phone, his eyes wide with fear. But when he saw his mother's face, pale and still, he froze. It was like the breath had been sucked from his chest. He knew deep down that nothing could save her. Not now. Liza shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "We've waited too long," she said. "It's too late." Marta's hand twitched, and she tried to open her eyes. For a moment, everything seemed to blur and fade, but then she saw their faces. Liza's tear-streaked face, Michael's horrified expression. She wanted to say something, to reassure them, but all she could do was squeeze Liza's hand gently. She couldn't make the pain go away. She couldn't fix what was broken. The darkness closed in around her, and Marta finally let herself slip away. The room was silent. The only sound was the soft, almost imperceptible ticking of the broken clock on the wall. It was the same clock Marta had bought when they had first moved into the apartment. It hadn't worked properly in years, but it had remained, a symbol of the time they had spent in this place. Now, it ticked on in a hollow, empty rhythm, as though mocking them. Liza couldn't remember when she had stopped crying. She had no more tears left, it seemed, as if her body had given up on the need to weep. She hadn't moved from her mother's side since the moment Marta had slipped away. She couldn't. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing inward with a weight she didn't know how to bear. Her eyes were red from the hours of staring at her mother's lifeless body. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one painful, like the act of breathing itself was too much to endure. Michael had sat beside her in silence, too stunned to speak, too stunned to even cry. He hadn't left Marta's side either. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of someone shuffling in place, too tired to move. Jacob, the youngest, was the only one who had managed to fall asleep. He lay on the couch, his small body curled up in a ball, blissfully unaware of the gravity of what had happened. In his innocent world, there was no death, no hunger, no pain. He had only known his mother's love, her warmth, and her constant care. He didn't understand that the woman who had held them together, who had fought to keep them alive, was gone. Liza's hands trembled as she reached for her mother's, feeling the coldness of the skin beneath her fingers. She couldn't bring herself to close her mother's eyes. It felt like an admission of finality that she wasn't ready to make. Liza wasn't ready to let go, even though she knew there was no other choice. Her mother was gone, and there was nothing left to do but face the unbearable truth. Michael shifted beside her, his face pale and drawn. His usually steady demeanor had shattered. He reached out, placing a hand on Liza's shoulder, his fingers cold against her skin. His eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of guilt and confusion. We should tell someone," he whispered, but the words felt foreign in the air. Who would they tell? What was there to say? Who would help them now? Liza turned her head slowly to look at him. "Who?" she asked softly, the word hanging in the air like a weight. Who could help them? Their mother had refused help for so long, clinging to the belief that they would survive on their own. They had all been so proud, so determined not to let anyone in. But now it was too late. "I don't know," Michael replied quietly. He didn't know, because no one had ever cared enough to offer them help when they needed it. They were just another family lost to the cracks, forgotten by the world outside. In the end, their struggle had been silent, a quiet suffering that no one noticed until it was too late. Liza closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply as if to steady herself, but the breath caught in her chest. She could still hear her mother's voice, the soft way she'd always tried to comfort them, even when things were at their worst. The words, so many times repeated, now felt like a cruel echo. It will get better. Just hold on. We'll get through this. But they hadn't gotten through it. They hadn't survived. And now, Liza was faced with a future that seemed impossibly bleak, a future without her mother to guide her. The hours passed, the sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness settled over the apartment. The weight of loss filled every corner. Liza had no idea what time it was. She wasn't sure if the hours had passed in minutes or in days. Her sense of time had fractured. The only thing that remained clear was the overwhelming sense of finality that hung over them. Michael stood up, his movements stiff and slow, and walked over to the kitchen. He turned the faucet, the water running cold, and stared at the stream as though it were the answer to something he couldn't put into words. Liza watched him silently, knowing he was lost in his own thoughts, battling with the same feelings of helplessness and confusion she was. "Do you think—" Michael's voice cracked, and he paused, trying to regain control. "Do you think she knew? Do you think she knew we couldn't save her?" Liza swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to let her speak. Of course Marta had known. She had known all along that they wouldn't make it without help. But she had held on anyway. She had given everything, her last bit of strength, her last breath, just to make sure her children didn't see how bad it had gotten. Liza closed her eyes again. Yes, Marta had known. She had known that her sacrifice would be the only way to give her children a chance. She had held on just long enough to make sure they wouldn't go hungry, just long enough to ensure they would have one more day of survival. But now, Liza understood. Now, she understood the price her mother had paid, the cost of trying to protect them from the world. And it was too much. It had been too much for one person to carry, and Liza knew that now, in the absence of their mother, they had to carry it all. "We need to bury her," Liza said finally, her voice firm, as though saying it out loud would make the reality of it more real, more bearable. Michael nodded, his face empty, but he didn't protest. They both knew that this was the only thing left to do. Liza stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked over to the small closet where they had kept the things they rarely used. It was a simple task, really, gathering a few old blankets and towels to wrap her mother's body. But it felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and the weight of their loss settled on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. Jacob stirred on the couch, his small body shifting as he woke. He blinked up at her sleepily, still not fully aware of what had happened. His innocent face looked up at her with trust, expecting everything to be the same as it always had been. But Liza couldn't offer him the reassurance he needed. She didn't know how to protect him from the reality of their world. "We're going to be okay," she said, though the words felt hollow, even to her. She wanted to believe them. She wanted to believe that they would survive, that they could carry on without their mother. But in that moment, she wasn't so sure. The sun had barely risen when Liza and Michael began to prepare for the hardest task they had ever faced. The apartment, though small, had once felt like home, filled with warmth and life. But now, the space was cold, hollow. Every inch of the room felt empty without their mother. The silence was deafening, suffocating. Liza could hear the faint sound of Jacob's breathing as he slept, but even that felt too loud in the heavy stillness. She glanced at Michael, who had been quiet since their last conversation. He had taken charge of gathering the blankets and towels to wrap their mother's body, but now he stood, motionless, staring at the floor. Liza could see the tremble in his hands as he clenched them into fists, as though fighting to keep the emotions at bay. She knew that they both needed to be strong, needed to get through this final act of mourning before they could think about what came next. But she could also see the strain in Michael's eyes, the cracks that had begun to form in the person he had once been. It was a quiet struggle, one they both understood without needing to speak. The world outside their apartment was just as cold, just as unforgiving. They had always known that survival came with a price, but now they were starting to understand the true cost of it. Marta's sacrifice had been the final, unspoken message of love to them, but it had also been a cruel reminder of the world they lived in, a world that didn't care. "I can't believe she's gone," Michael said finally, his voice rough. The words seemed to hang in the air, carrying with them all the weight of their grief. Liza didn't respond right away. She couldn't. Words felt too small, too insignificant in the face of what they had just lost. Instead, she turned toward the kitchen, her eyes focusing on the empty shelves, the vacant countertops. There was nothing left. No food, no supplies, no hope. It was a harsh realization, one that she had tried to avoid for so long. They were truly alone now. They would have to face the future without their mother, without the one person who had always been their pillar of strength. Her chest tightened as she fought the urge to break down again. They couldn't afford that. Not now. They had to stay focused, had to find a way to survive. They had to honor their mother's sacrifice, even if it meant pushing through the pain. She turned back to Michael, whose eyes were locked on their mother's body, now wrapped in the simple blankets they had gathered. His face was pale, drawn. He didn't look like the same person who had held things together when everything seemed to fall apart. They had both lost so much, and yet the true loss, the one that gnawed at them both, was the future that seemed so uncertain now. "We need to bury her," Liza said softly, the words heavy. It was the only thing they could do. The thought of leaving their mother unburied was unbearable. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure how they would manage it. They had no money, no resources. What would people think when they saw the state they were in? Would they help? Or would they turn their backs, just like they always had? Michael nodded, though his eyes were still distant. "Where? We don't even have a yard. We can't just leave her like this." Liza understood his hesitation. They had always been isolated from the world outside. They had never been close to anyone in their neighborhood. The idea of asking for help seemed almost impossible. But she also knew that they couldn't keep their mother's body in the apartment. She had to be laid to rest. They would find a way somehow. She looked out the window, the same view she had seen every day for years. The bustling streets of the city, the noise, the endless movement. The world outside was alive, full of people who had no idea what was happening inside this small, dark apartment. People who had their own struggles, their own burdens to carry. The thought of reaching out, of asking for help, seemed almost like an intrusion into a world that had already forgotten them. But they had no choice. They had to try. For Marta. For themselves. "We'll figure it out," Liza said, her voice resolute. "I don't know how, but we will. We have to." Michael didn't argue. He couldn't. They had no other option. They couldn't just let their mother's death be another forgotten tragedy. She deserved more than that. She had fought so hard, and they owed her everything. Liza took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone, which had been silent for days. She hadn't wanted to call anyone, hadn't wanted to admit how bad things had gotten. But now, there was no other choice. She dialed the number of the one person who might help them. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up. "Hello?" The voice was unfamiliar, but the tone was kind, warm. "Hello?" Liza said, her voice wavering. I don't know who else to call. We need help." The person on the other end paused. "What kind of help do you need?" Liza swallowed hard. "My mom. She passed away. We don't know what to do. We have no money, no way to pay for a funeral, and we can't keep her here. Please, can you help us?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Liza felt a wave of panic rising in her chest. Had she made a mistake? Would they hang up on her? Would they ignore her like everyone else had? Then the voice spoke again, softer this time. "I'm so sorry to hear that. I can connect you with someone who might be able to help with funeral arrangements. Just hold on, okay?" Liza's heart raced. She couldn't believe it. Someone was offering to help. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to listen. But someone was going to help them lay their mother to rest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a small shred of hope. "Thank you," Liza whispered, her voice breaking as the weight of the situation finally hit her. "Thank you." After a few minutes, the voice returned, explaining the next steps, how they could get the paperwork started, where to go, what they needed to do. Liza absorbed the information, each word a lifeline in the midst of their despair. When the call ended, Liza turned to Michael, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're going to help us," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not alone. We're not—" Michael blinked at her, as though he was trying to process what she was saying. "Are you sure? This isn't just someone being nice out of pity, is it?" Liza shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "No, they're going to help us. We're going to bury Mom. We're going to do this." Michael didn't say anything, but he looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. There was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that had been missing for a long time. A glimmer of hope. It was a small thing, a tiny flicker, but in the midst of everything that had happened, it was enough. Enough to push them forward, enough to keep them going.